The deed hit the table with a sound like a gunshot. Every man in that crowded land office went still. Hats stopped moving. Boots stopped shuffling. Even the flies seemed to pause their lazy circuits above the unwashed heads of the ranchers and hired hands who had packed themselves into the small, stuffy room on the edge of Redemption Valley, Wyoming, in the summer of 1882. Elvira Bancroft did not flinch. She stood at the counter with her back straight as a fence post, her dark traveling coat still dusty from 300 miles of hard riding, and she looked at the land agent, a round, sweating man named Gerald Potts, with eyes the color of strong coffee and twice as bitter when she chose them to be. "Read it," she said. Her voice was quiet. That was the most dangerous part of it. Gerald Potts looked at the document she had placed before him, and then he looked at the 12 men behind her who had all come in that morning expecting to divide the Bancroft estate among themselves, and then he looked back at the document, and his face went the color of old tallow. "Mrs. Bancroft," he began. "Read it out loud," she said, "so everyone in this room understands what they are looking at." The room was the size of a generous pantry, and it smelled of tobacco, sweat, and desperation. The men at the back craned their necks. The men at the front leaned in. At the far edge of the crowd, near the door he had propped open with one boot heel because the heat was unconscionable, Henry Ellsworth crossed his arms over his chest and watched the widow with an expression that had not yet decided what it was. He had heard about her. Everybody in Redemption Valley had heard about her, because when a man like Thomas Bancroft died and left behind a woman and a fortune worth fighting over, word traveled on the wind faster than wildfire. The widow was coming, people said. The widow had been informed, people said. The widow would arrive and be bought out or scared out, or simply persuaded that a woman alone had no business holding range land in a valley where the water rights were worth more than gold, and where 3 separate cattle operations depended on those same rights to survive the dry season. What nobody had said was that the widow was 31 years old, had studied land law at her father's knee for a decade and a half, and had ridden her own horse the entire distance from Cheyenne without a single outrider, a single companion, or a single moment of apparent uncertainty. Henry Ellsworth looked at her and felt something shift in his chest that he could not immediately identify or name. Gerald Potts cleared his throat and read. The words that came out of his mouth silenced even the flies. The deed was not for a portion of the Bancroft range. It was not for the widow's rights to the house and the kitchen garden, and the modest sum of a few $100s that Thomas Bancroft's lawyer in Denver had assured everyone was the entirety of what she was entitled to. The deed was for all of it, every acre, every water right, every fence post, every head of cattle, every inch of the valley that bore the Bancroft name. Thomas had signed it over to her 3 months before he died, had it witnessed by a federal judge in Cheyenne, and had it notarized and sealed in a manner that was, as Gerald Potts' voice indicated with increasing despair as he read further, absolutely and completely unassailable. One man at the back of the room said a word that a lady of the era would not have repeated. Several others echoed his sentiment. Elvira Bancroft picked up the deed, folded it once along its existing crease with the care of someone who had handled important documents all her life, and slid it back inside the leather satchel she wore across her body. "Gentlemen," she said, and the word carried the same weight a judge might bring to a sentencing, "I would suggest you all take the rest of the day to get your affairs in order. I will be reviewing every grazing lease and water agreement on this land beginning tomorrow morning. Anyone whose papers are not in order by Friday should not expect those agreements to continue." She turned and walked toward the door, and the crowd parted before her the way water parts before a stone dropped from a height, not gently, but with a sudden and involuntary force. Henry Ellsworth stepped out of her way. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. His were gray, like the sky before a serious storm, and he wore the expression of a man who had just watched something happen that he had not thought possible. She did not slow down. She did not smile. She walked through the door and into the brilliant, punishing Wyoming sunlight, and behind her the land office erupted into the sound of 12 men talking at once. Henry stayed where he was for a long moment, one hand still braced on the door frame, watching the dust settle in her wake. "Well," said the man next to him, an older rancher named Calhoun who ran beef on the east side of the valley, "there goes trouble." "No," Henry said slowly, and something in his voice surprised even himself. "I think trouble just got sorted." He was wrong, of course, about how easy it would be, but he was not wrong about her. 3 weeks earlier, Elvira Bancroft had been sitting in a law office in Cheyenne reading the letter that changed everything, and she had been doing it alone because that was how she did most things that mattered. The letter was from Thomas's solicitor, a man named Archibald Drum who had practiced law in Denver for 30 years, and who had written to her not with condolences, which had arrived separately and perfunctorily, but with news. Thomas had altered his will. Thomas had, in fact, done something far more significant than alter his will. He had transferred title to the entire Bancroft estate directly into her name before his death, which meant the matter bypassed probate entirely, which meant that the collection of ambitious ranchers and water speculators who had already begun dividing the valley in their minds had no legal ground to stand on whatsoever. Elvira had read the letter twice, set it down, poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher on the desk, and sat very still for several minutes. She was not crying. She had done most of her crying in the weeks immediately after Thomas died, quietly, privately, the way she did everything that required her to be soft. Thomas had been her husband for 6 years, and he had been a good man in the specific way that older men could be good when they had spent enough time being bad already, and had decided to stop. He was not a passionate love. He was a kind, respectful partnership that had given her a home and a purpose, and the freedom to run his books and his accounts with the sharp, precise mind she had been given, and that most men in her life had tried, with varying degrees of aggression, to discourage her from using. He had known what he was doing when he signed the deed. She understood that. He had seen what was coming. His health had been failing for 2 years, and the vultures had been circling for longer than that. And Thomas Bancroft, for all his rough edges and frontier-worn ways, had been a man who understood loyalty and who paid his debts, and he had considered her investment of 6 years of her life a debt worth paying in the most concrete way he knew how. She folded the letter, packed her trunk, and began the process of converting everything she owned into the most portable and legally defensible form available to her. She hired a lawyer in Cheyenne to make 3 certified copies of the deed, placed one with the federal land office in the capital, sent one by trusted courier to Archibald Drum, and kept the original on her person at all times in the leather satchel her father had given her when she left his house at 17. She thought about hiring outriders. She thought about it for about 40 minutes, going through the practical arguments on both sides with the same methodical efficiency she brought to every problem, and then she decided against it. Outriders would signal wealth. They would signal fear, and they would slow her down. She had been riding since she was 5 years old. She knew horses with an intimacy that most men would have found startling. The way she could read a horse's temperament from across a corral. The way she could assess soundness from the angle of a hoof before the animal had taken 3 steps. The way she could communicate through reins and weight and breath with a subtlety that looked, to those who did not know better, like magic. She bought a sound gray mare in Cheyenne, named her Arithmetic because she was precise and reliable and never made unnecessary moves, and she rode south and west into the edge of the world. Redemption Valley was beautiful in a way that did not apologize for itself. It sat between 2 mountain ranges like something cupped in enormous hands, and the grass in summer was the kind of green that made you understand why men fought over land, why they lied for it and killed for it and bent every law and instinct they possessed to hold it. The Bancroft land ran along the valley's main water source, a clear, cold river called the Mersey that came down from the mountains and fed everything that grew and lived in the valley below. Whoever held the Mersey rights held the valley. Thomas had held them for 20 years. Elvira held them now. Henry Ellsworth's family did not hold them, but they were neighbors. His ranch, the Double E, sat on the western boundary of the Bancroft land, and he ran about 800 head of cattle on range that depended seasonally on access to the Mersey, access that Thomas had always granted freely because Henry's father, Marcus Ellsworth, had been the kind of neighbor worth keeping. Marcus had died 2 years ago. Henry ran the Double E now, and he ran it the same way his father had run it, with hard work and straight dealing, and a stubbornness about ethics that had cost him business opportunities more than once, and that he considered worth every lost dollar. He was 34 years old, had never been married, not for lack of opportunities, but for a specific and particular shortage of the right kind of woman, a woman who could match him honestly, who did not need to be managed or protected from the truth of what frontier life was. He had met women who wanted safety and women who wanted adventure and women who wanted a certain kind of story, but he had not yet met one who simply, plainly, without decoration or pretense, wanted to do the work of living with the same direct and unglamorous commitment that he brought to it himself. He had not been in the land office that morning for any scheming purpose. He had come to file a water access renewal, a perfectly routine piece of paperwork that he filed every year, and he had walked into the middle of a confrontation that had been building for 3 weeks, and that resolved itself in approximately 4 minutes in the most decisive fashion he had ever witnessed. He thought about her for the rest of that day with an intensity that he found mildly irritating, because Henry Ellsworth was not a man who made a habit of being distracted, and she was very distracting in a way that had nothing to do with how she looked, although she looked fine, traveled as she was, and everything to do with the way she had stood in that room full of men who wanted to take what was hers, and had not even bothered to raise her voice. He told himself it was just the situation that was interesting. He almost believed it. By the time the sun went down that evening, and he was eating his supper in the cookhouse with his 2 hired hands, a Mexican man named Rodrigo and a young Wyoming-born cowboy named Pete, who was 22 and perpetually optimistic, he had made a decision. He was going to the Bancroft house in the morning. Not because of any hidden motive or territorial ambition, but because the water access renewal he had come to file that morning was now complicated by the change of ownership, and he needed to reestablish it with whoever held title, and the person who held title was Elvira Bancroft, and there was absolutely no reason in the world that ought to be a complicated thing to do. Rodrigo watched him across the table with the knowing eyes of a man who had worked for the Ellsworth family for 11 years and had known Henry since the boy was barely more than half the size he was now. "You are going to go see her, then," Rodrigo said. "Going to file my water access papers," Henry said. "Yes," Rodrigo said, in a tone that indicated he believed this was accurate and also that it was not the entire story. The Bancroft house was not quite a house and not quite a ranch headquarters. It was somewhere between the two, a large log and stone structure that Thomas Bancroft had built over the course of a decade, adding rooms as he could afford them, so that the final result was sprawling and somewhat unpredictable in its architecture but solid, well chinked, and backed by a barn that was the finest building on the property. When Henry rode up at 10 o'clock the next morning, he found the barn doors open and the sound of activity inside, and because his instincts were the instincts of a man who had grown up around livestock, he went to the barn first. Elvira was inside with a horse he did not recognize, a big bay gelding that was standing tied in the crossed eyes, and that was sweating and blowing through its nostrils with its ears pinned flat, the unmistakable posture of an animal that had decided it was going to be difficult. She was running her hands along its left foreleg with a calmness that seemed, to Henry's eye, either very brave or very informed, and she was murmuring something low and steady that he could not make out. He stopped in the doorway. He did not announce himself, not out of any particular strategy, but because he did not want to startle the horse. The horse knew he was there. Its ears swiveled toward the door and it shifted its weight, and he saw the muscles along its hindquarters bunch in that warning way, the way horses moved before they moved in a direction you did not want them to move. He tensed, ready to step back. Elvira did not look up. She moved her hand to the horse's shoulder, one slow, deliberate sweep that started just below the mane and traveled down and back, and she said something that Henry still could not make out, but that seemed to be a single repeated phrase, and the horse's hindquarters unlocked. Its ears came forward. It blew out a long, shuddering breath through its nose and dropped its head about 6 inches, and stood there like a different animal entirely. The whole thing took about 15 seconds. Henry stood in the doorway with his arms at his sides and felt something he had not felt in a very long time, which was the particular and somewhat uncomfortable sensation of being completely and unexpectedly astonished. She straightened up, dusted her hands together once, and turned and looked at him with an expression that was neither surprised nor entirely welcoming. "Mr. Ellsworth," she said. She said his name as though she had looked it up in a ledger already, which he suspected she had. "Your ranch is on the western boundary." "That's right," he said. He had ridden up here intending to be businesslike and competent, and he was finding it slightly difficult to organize his thoughts in a way that reflected those intentions. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I can wait outside." "You can come in," she said. He settled now. She nodded toward the bay. He had a stone bruise about 3 weeks ago that was treated incorrectly. The leg healed crooked at the hoof capsule, and it's been sending pain signals up the limb. He's been anticipating being hurt every time someone touches him. Henry walked in slowly, angling himself the way you approached a horse you were not sure about, and stood at a respectful distance from the bay, who regarded him with the kind of cautious neutrality that was, for this horse, apparently a significant improvement. "You could tell all that just from the way he was standing?" he asked. "From the way he was standing and the way he was holding his foot and the way he shifted his weight when I came into the barn and the heat in the leg when I ran my hands down it," she said. "Yes." She moved to the small workbench at the side of the barn and picked up a hoof pick and a jar of something Henry did not recognize, dark and strongly scented. "My father was a farrier," she said. "Not just a farrier, a horseman of the old school. He believed that every problem a horse has is a communication, not a character flaw. He taught me to listen." She paused, the jar in her hand, and looked at Henry with a directness that he was starting to understand was simply how she looked at things. "You came about the water access." "I did," he said. "The renewal is standard. I've already pulled the record from Thomas's files." She set the jar down, wiped her hands on a cloth that hung from the bench, and turned fully to face him. "I'm not planning to restrict the Double E's access to the Mercy. Your family has held that agreement for 20 years, and you've always honored the terms." The relief that moved through him was real and significant, but what he noticed alongside it was a kind of respect that had been building since the moment he walked in and watched her quiet that horse. A respect that was sharpening itself on every word she spoke into something much more specific and much more personal than professional admiration. "I'm glad to hear it," he said. "And I want you to know, I wasn't one of the men in that office yesterday who had any interest in contesting what's yours." She studied him. Not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of someone who has learned the hard way that interest and honesty do not always travel together. "Why did you come in then?" she asked. "Water access renewal," he said. "Like I said." Something moved in her expression. The faintest thing, barely a softening, and then it was gone. "You're welcome to stay for coffee," she said, "while I finish up here. There are things worth discussing about the valley. Things I suspect you know that I don't, and things I know that you might find useful." It was not a warm invitation. It was a practical offer, mutually beneficial, clear-eyed. He recognized it as the kind of offer he would have made himself in similar circumstances. "Thank you," he said. "I'll take you up on that." He helped her with the horse. She did not ask him to, but she did not stop him either, and they worked together in the wordless, efficient way of two people who both knew what they were doing and did not need to explain themselves. He held the lead rope with the steady, quiet pressure she indicated without words, just a glance and a slight positioning of her hands, while she cleaned the hoof and applied the preparation from the dark jar, which turned out to be a drawing poultice of her own making, and he watched her hands work with a focus that he was somewhat glad she could not see. They had coffee on the porch in tin cups, because most of the household goods were still packed or disorganized in the aftermath of Thomas's death, and the sudden need for her to be elsewhere. The view from the porch was the kind of view that made a person understand things about geography and ambition and why people built in particular places. The valley spread below them, the Mersey glinting in the morning light a quarter-mile away, the mountains behind it purple and enormous. "Tell me about the other water claims," she said, and she had a small leather notebook in her lap and a pencil, and she was writing. He told her everything. He told her about the two men who had been quietly constructing an upstream diversion on the eastern tributary. A man named Silas Pratt who ran cattle, and who had a dark past that most people in the valley only alluded to in careful, indirect terms, and Pratt's business partner. A speculator from the east named Colton Walsh, who had arrived in the valley 8 months ago, and who had the particular kind of charm that Henry associated with the kind of man you should not trust with anything you valued. He told her about the legal challenge that Pratt and Walsh had apparently already prepared, a petition to the territorial court claiming adverse water rights based on a technicality in the original Bancroft land grant. He told her about the tension that had been simmering for 6 months before Thomas died, and that had come very close to open conflict more than once. She wrote steadily and asked questions at precise intervals, and every question revealed that she had already understood the structure of the situation and was now filling in specific details. Henry found himself doing something he almost never did, which was talking freely to someone he did not yet fully know. It was the quality of her listening that made it easy. She listened the way a person reads, with full attention and active comprehension, and she did not interrupt except when a question was genuinely necessary. "Walsh is the more dangerous one," she said at a pause. "Pratt is the one who will act, but Walsh is the one who will plan." "That's my read," Henry said. "Good," she said. "Then we agree on the threat." She looked up from her notebook and directly at him, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the space between their chairs, two people who had just, without particularly intending to, become something like partners in a problem that neither of them had created. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked with the directness she brought to everything, and it deserved a genuine answer. He thought about it honestly before he answered. "Because what Pratt and Walsh are doing is wrong," he said, "and because the valley works better when it works fairly." And he paused, choosing the next words carefully, "because you seem like someone who intends to be here for the long term and not just sell at the first opportunity, and I would rather have you as a neighbor than either of those two." She held his gaze for a moment longer. "All right," she said. "That's a sufficient answer." She looked back at her notebook. "I'll need the exact location of the diversion site." They made plans that morning in the methodical, practical manner of two people who are accustomed to solving problems by thinking clearly rather than reacting emotionally. And by the time he rode back to the Double E in the late afternoon, Henry Ellsworth was in a state of mind that he had no reliable category for, and that kept him awake until well past midnight. The trap that Pratt and Walsh had set was more elaborate than it initially appeared. Elvira discovered this on her 3rd day in the valley, when she rode the boundary of the Bancroft land with Thomas's old foreman, a weathered man of 52 named Samuel Greer, who had stayed on because he had nowhere particular to go, and because he was, at heart, the kind of man who needed work to feel like himself. She had hired him formally within an hour of meeting him, after a conversation in which she asked him 14 direct questions and received 14 direct answers, and decided he was worth trusting. The diversion works that Pratt and Walsh had constructed were not simply a matter of redirecting water flow for their own convenience. They were part of a larger scheme that involved a claim, already filed but not yet adjudicated, asserting that the Bancroft land grant contained a survey error in its original 1863 filing, a boundary discrepancy of about 40 yards along the eastern edge that, if accepted, would place the primary intake of the Mersey River outside Bancroft land entirely, and therefore outside Elvira's ownership. This was, in its way, an elegant piece of legal engineering. And it would have worked perfectly, Elvira believed, against almost any other person who might have inherited the Bancroft estate. It did not account for the fact that she had, in the 6 weeks between learning about the deed and arriving in the valley, already obtained a copy of the original 1863 survey from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, and had spent 4 evenings at her boarding house table going over it with the instruments her father had taught her to use: the compass, and the chain, and the careful, patient art of understanding what a surveyor's marks on paper meant when translated to actual ground. She said nothing about this to anyone except, after some consideration, Henry, because she had decided by the 3rd day that Henry Ellsworth was not a man who would use information she gave him against her, and because she needed someone who knew the land on the ground to confirm what her paper measurements suggested. She rode to the Double E on the 4th morning with her satchel and a rolled-up paper tube that contained the copy of the original survey. Henry saw her coming from the corral and felt his pulse do something he was not going to examine too closely. He went to meet her at the gate, and she dismounted with the easy, economical motion of someone who had spent more time on a horse than off one. "I need you to walk the eastern boundary with me," she said, "and tell me if the landmarks match the survey." He looked at the rolled paper she was carrying. "You have a copy of the original survey," he said. "I have the original survey's certified copy, obtained from the Territorial Land Office," she said. "I also have, in my own analysis, a significant problem for Pratt and Walsh." They rode the boundary that afternoon, Samuel Greer following at a respectful distance, and Elvira moved along the eastern edge of the Bancroft land with a folded section of the survey in one hand and a compass in the other, stopping at intervals to take bearings and compare them to the notations on the paper, and Henry rode alongside her and answered her questions about the landmarks, the particular rock formation near the creek bend, the stand of cottonwoods at the lower end of the eastern rise, the old survey stake, still visible under a growth of grass, that marked the original southeastern corner. He watched her work with a focus that was professional and a wonder that was not. She moved with the sureness of someone who understood what she was doing at every step, and she cross-referenced her compass bearings with the survey notations with a speed and accuracy that told him she had been over this map many times before she brought it to this ground. And when she stopped finally at the specific point near the creek where Pratt and Walsh's claim alleged the boundary error existed, she took 3 careful bearings, noted them in her leather book, looked at the survey and said quietly, "There is no error." "You're certain?" he said. "I'm certain. The original survey was accurate. The creek intake is here," she pointed to a spot on the survey, "and the boundary runs here." She drew an invisible line in the air about 12 feet to the east of where Walsh had placed his stakes. "The claim is fabricated, completely fabricated. The actual survey, cross-referenced with these landmarks and compass bearings, places the boundary exactly where it has always been. Pratt and Walsh are relying on the assumption that nobody will bother to do this work, or that nobody who inherits this land will know how." She folded the survey with practiced hands and looked at him, and he looked back at her, and the late afternoon sun was doing something specific to the color of her hair that he was not going to think about because it was not relevant to the situation. "When you say you can prove this," he said carefully, "You mean you can prove it to a court?" "I can prove it to a court, yes," she said. "I was also trained, briefly, in surveying by my father's friend who was a professional surveyor in Colorado, and I can repeat these measurements with a proper chain in front of a judge or a federal land commissioner and get exactly the same result every time." She paused. "I should tell you, because I suspect it will be relevant, that I also had a second copy of the original survey authenticated by the Federal Land Office before I left Cheyenne. If Walsh's lawyers produce a doctored version, I have documentation that precedes any alteration they might attempt." Henry Ellsworth sat on his horse in the late Wyoming afternoon and was, for the second time in 4 days, completely shocked. He had been impressed before. He had felt the pull of admiration toward her since the moment in the barn, but this was different. This was the recognition, clear and undeniable, that he was in the presence of a mind that had planned 3 steps further ahead than anyone else involved, that had anticipated the hidden motive before it was revealed, that had done the actual work of protecting what was hers with a precision and thoroughness that made the scheme against her look, in retrospect, almost quaint. "Elvira," he said, and then stopped, because he had used her first name without thinking about it, and this was only the 4th day he had known her. She did not correct him. Something moved in her eyes, brief and guarded, but she did not look away. "The court proceeding will still be unpleasant," she said. "Walsh has money and Pratt has local connections. They will try other means before the legal matter is settled." "Yes," he said, "they will." He gathered himself. "I want you to know that the Double E will be standing with you, formally, if it comes to that. I can provide testimony about the landmarks if needed, and I'll make it known in the valley where I stand." She looked at him for a long moment, and there was something in it that he thought might be gratitude, though it was the kind of gratitude that someone feels when they realize they are not alone, not the smaller gratitude of being rescued. "Thank you," she said. It was simple and direct, like everything she said, and it landed with more weight than a longer sentence would have. They rode back together in the softening light, and the silence between them was the kind that is not empty but full of things that are taking their time finding their shape. Walsh made his first move 6 days later. He came to the Bancroft house with 2 lawyers and a redrawn survey map, and a confidence that, Henry thought when he heard about it afterward from Samuel Greer, must have required real work to maintain given the actual situation. Elvira received him in Thomas's study, which she had spent the intervening days organizing into a working office, the financial records indexed and cross-referenced, the land documents filed in order of date and legal significance, the whole room expressing, to anyone who looked carefully, that it was being run by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Walsh laid out his case with the practiced ease of a man who had done this before. The survey discrepancy, the misplacement of the boundary, the implication that the original Bancroft grant had always been slightly smaller than recorded, and that the proper legal remedy was a renegotiation of the eastern boundary that would, coincidentally, place the primary water intake entirely within land that Walsh and Pratt were prepared to purchase at a reasonable price. He was smooth about it. He was charming about it. He was the kind of man who understood that women in this period could be made to feel uncertain about their own judgment, could be made to feel that the complexity of legal matters was beyond them, that the sensible thing was to trust the men who were explaining the situation so helpfully and reasonably. Elvira waited until he finished. Then she opened her desk drawer and placed 3 items in front of him. The first was the certified copy of the original 1863 survey with the federal authentication stamp. The second was the notebook, open to the page where she had recorded her compass bearings at every landmark along the eastern boundary. The third was a letter from the Territorial Surveyor General's office in Cheyenne, which she had written to immediately upon obtaining the survey and which contained, in the precise and official language of that office, a preliminary assessment that the original 1863 survey was accurate, complete, and showed no boundary error of any kind. Walsh looked at the 3 items for a long moment. His charm, Henry was told, slipped just a little. Not enough that a casual observer would have caught it, but enough that Elvira caught it, and she watched him recalibrate with the calm, attentive expression of someone who had expected exactly this. "I will be filing a formal response to any legal challenge within the month," she said. "If you wish to pursue this matter in court, I am fully prepared to do so. If you would prefer to withdraw the claim and renegotiate the terms of any legitimate grazing agreements your clients may wish to maintain with the Bancroft land, I am willing to have that conversation on reasonable terms." Walsh left without committing to either course. But he left, and Elvira was still in her study, and the 3 documents were still on her desk. Pratt's response was less sophisticated. 2 nights after Walsh's visit, someone cut the fence line on the northern edge of the Bancroft land, and approximately 40 head of Pratt's cattle moved through the gap and onto Bancroft grass. This was, in the language of the range, a provocation of a fairly serious order. In a different year, or with a different person, it might have been the beginning of a range war. Henry found out at 6 in the morning when Pete came riding to the Double E cookhouse before breakfast with the news, which Pete had gotten from Samuel Greer, which Samuel Greer had gotten from Elvira herself, who had apparently discovered the situation at 4 in the morning because she was already up and walking the fence line by lamplight, an activity she apparently did when she could not sleep. Henry was saddled and riding before 7. He found her at the gap in the fence, mounted on arithmetic, watching with an expression of composed attention, while Samuel and 2 day laborers she had hired from the nearest town worked to repair the cut wire. The strayed cattle had been identified and were standing in a loose bunch at the edge of a creek, apparently indifferent to the difficulty they had caused. Henry pulled up beside her. "Anyone hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "The fence will be repaired by mid-morning. I've written a letter to Silas Pratt documenting the date, the location of the cut, and the number of strayed animals. I'll be sending it today by the mail rider. And if Pratt doesn't respond, then I have a record of the incident and its date and the names of 3 witnesses, and he does not." She watched Samuel work for a moment. "It's worth knowing how someone responds to documentation," she said. "Men who are accustomed to operating without accountability often don't know how to behave when there's a record." Henry considered this. "He might try something rougher next time," he said. "Pratt's got a couple of hired men who have been known to be rough in the past. There were incidents before you arrived that didn't get officially reported." She turned to look at him, and her expression was serious but not afraid. "I know," she said. "Thomas mentioned it in his letters to me the last year of his life. That's part of why he put the deed in my name, directly instead of through probate. He didn't want me spending 6 months in legal proceedings without clear title while Pratt and Walsh made their moves." She paused. Thomas was a practical man. I respected him for it. There was something in the way she said it, honest and clear-eyed and without any false sentiment, that made Henry feel a particular kind of tenderness toward her that was not romantic, or not only romantic, but the deeper kind that comes from respecting the truth someone tells about their own life. "Were you happy with him?" he asked, and then was surprised at himself for asking because it was a personal question, and he was not a man who asked personal questions easily. She did not seem to mind it. "I was content," she said carefully. "I was valued. He let me be myself, which is not as small a thing as it might sound in some arrangements." She looked back at the fence line. "I was not in love with him, we both understood that, but I was faithful to him and I worked hard for him, and when he was sick I cared for him, and I think we were honest with each other, which I consider the foundation of anything real." "That's more than a lot of people get," Henry said. "Yes," she said, "it is." The fence was repaired. The cattle were returned to Pratt's land through a gate that Elvira made a point of having recorded in a note to Pratt's own ranch hand who had arrived, sheepishly, to collect them. Everything was documented. Everything was witnessed. Everything was managed with the careful, thorough competence that Henry was coming to understand was not just a professional manner, but an expression of who she was, the same way the directness was, the same way the early morning fence walks, and the ability to quiet a difficult horse, and the compass bearings along the eastern boundary, were all expressions of the same core thing. He stayed for coffee again. This was becoming a pattern, and he was not pretending not to notice. She had moved the kitchen into some semblance of order, and the coffee was good and strong in the way frontier coffee was when someone was paying attention to it. And they sat at the kitchen table with the morning light coming through the south window and talked about things that had nothing to do with water rights or fence lines. She asked him about the double E, about how his father had built it, about what the valley had been like when he was young. He told her, and he asked her in return about her father the farrier, about growing up moving from town to town following the work, about how she had come to learn the things she knew. "I read everything I could get my hands on," she said, matter-of-factly. "Every book my father owned, which were not many but which he had chosen well, every newspaper we could afford, every document that passed through our hands. When we were in a town long enough for me to attend a school, I attended. When we were not, I learned from whoever was willing to teach me." She wrapped her hands around her tin cup. "My father believed that knowledge was portable. He said the one thing nobody could take from you was what you understood." Henry thought about the deed in the leather satchel, and the surveying instruments and the 3 preemptive letters to government offices, and he thought that Thomas Bancroft's widow had taken that lesson and built her entire life around it. "He sounds like a good man," Henry said. "He was the best person I've ever known," she said simply, and looked out the window. He did not push on the moment. He let it be what it was, and after a while the conversation moved on, and he noticed that the kitchen table was very comfortable, and that an hour had passed without him noticing it passing. He made himself leave at mid-morning. He had work to do, and she had work to do, and neither of them was the kind of person who ignored work. But he rode home thinking about her in a way that had moved well past professional admiration and was becoming, he had to be honest with himself, something considerably more disorganized and urgent than that. Walsh filed his legal challenge 3 weeks later, and the matter came before a federal territorial judge named Ezra Combs, who was based out of Laramie, and who arrived in Redemption Valley on a Thursday in late July with a court recorder and a determination to handle the matter in the efficient manner of a man who had a great deal of territory to cover and limited patience for what he privately considered frontier dramatics. Elvira had spent those 3 weeks preparing her case with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything. She had written to Archibald Drum in Denver and asked him to come, not because she needed to hide behind him, but because she needed a licensed attorney of record, and because Drum, who had known Thomas well and who had arranged the deed transfer, was familiar with the history of the grant and could speak to it. She had prepared a bound document containing the original survey copy, her compass bearings and their methodology, the Surveyor General's preliminary letter, a sworn affidavit from a professional surveyor she had hired to independently verify her measurements, and a summary of the legal history of the Bancroft land grant from 1863 to the present. She had also written to the Federal Land Office in Washington, which was perhaps excessive but which she considered appropriate given the systematic nature of what Walsh and Pratt had attempted. The response from Washington had not yet arrived by the time of the hearing, but she had informed Judge Combs of the correspondence in her preliminary filing. The hearing took place in the biggest room available in Redemption, which was the saloon cleared of tables and chairs for the occasion. Henry came. He sat in the front row. He had put on a clean shirt and brushed his hat, and he told himself he was there because he might be called as a witness regarding the landmarks, which was true. Walsh's lawyers were good. They were from Denver, expensively dressed, and they made their case with a precision that was clearly designed to overwhelm rather than illuminate, the kind of legal argument that is built not from truth but from complexity, from layers of technicality and precedent and carefully worded language that was meant to obscure what was actually quite simple. Judge Combs let them finish. Then he looked at Elvira Bancroft, who was sitting at the respondent's table next to Archibald Drum, and he said, "Mrs. Bancroft, you may respond." She stood. She presented her case in 35 minutes. She explained the original survey, the methodology of her verification, the independent surveyor's confirmation, the Surveyor General's preliminary assessment. She spoke in plain, precise language without any embellishment or oratorical flourish, the kind of language that, Henry thought, listening, was so clear and so well organized that it left no room for confusion or misrepresentation. She held up the bound document and offered it as exhibit. She walked Judge Combs through the compass bearings as though she were teaching a class, which in a sense she was, and the judge, who was a man of some intelligence himself, leaned forward in his chair and paid close attention. Walsh's lawyers attempted a cross-examination. It lasted 12 minutes before she had systematically dismantled every question with documented answers, and they ran out of angles. Silas Pratt, sitting in the gallery, went progressively redder in the face and said nothing. Judge Combs took 30 minutes. He came back and ruled for Elvira on every point. The boundary was where the original survey had always placed it. The water intake was Bancroft land. The claim was dismissed. He also, in an additional note from the bench that he clearly considered important, stated that any further attempts to manufacture boundary disputes through fabricated survey claims would be treated as fraud upon the court. The room was very quiet after he said it. Walsh and his lawyers left quickly. Pratt sat for a moment longer, his face cycling through emotions that were all dark, and then he stood and left too. Henry found Elvira outside on the boardwalk afterward, talking to Archibald Drum, and he waited until Drum had taken his leave, and then he walked over to her, and she turned as he came and looked at him with the expression she had been wearing all day, composed and clear and giving nothing away, and then something behind it shifted. "It's over," he said. "The legal part is over," she said. "Pratt will be angry for a while, but angry men make mistakes, and documented mistakes are useful." He shook his head slightly, not in disagreement but in a kind of wondering amusement. "Elvira," he said, and this time her name came naturally without self-correction. "That was one of the finest things I have ever watched anyone do." She looked at him, and the composed expression flickered for a moment, and he thought he saw something that might have been the specific vulnerability of someone who had worked very hard and done it largely alone and was not entirely sure what to do with direct acknowledgement. "It was just work," she said, but her voice was slightly different when she said it. "There's no such thing as just about it," he said. "You planned that from the moment you were in Cheyenne, before you ever set foot in this valley. You walked in here 3 steps ahead of everyone who thought they had you trapped, and you won it fair and clean and in front of a judge." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was strong and the boardwalk was warm under their feet, and somewhere down the street a horse was pulling at a hitching ring. "My father would have been pleased," she said quietly. "You should be pleased," he said, and something in her face finally let go of its strict control just for a moment, and she smiled. It was not a large smile. It was brief and private and slightly surprised at itself, and it made Henry Ellsworth feel as though the whole of the Wyoming sky had shifted 2 inches to the left. "Come for supper," she said. "Tomorrow. I've learned the range of the kitchen, and I think I can manage something worth eating." "I'd be glad to," he said. The next 3 months were, in the language of the heart, a slow and careful and entirely serious unfolding. They were also, in the practical language of 2 people running adjacent properties, extremely productive. Henry knew the valley. Elvira knew the books and the legal landscape, and the science of the land in a way that came from study and instinct combined. They began consulting each other naturally, without arrangement, as a matter of course, and the consulting became talking, and the talking became the kind of thing that started in a kitchen over coffee and ended on a porch in the dark, with neither party entirely certain how the hours had passed. Pratt remained sullen and distant. He did not cut the fence again, and he did not make any further legal moves, and Henry suspected that Walsh had calculated the costs of a second round and declined to support one. The threat was not entirely gone. It was never entirely gone in that place and time, but it had receded to a manageable background tension, the kind that watchful people could monitor without being consumed by. Rodrigo, at the Double E, began preparing larger amounts of food for the evenings that Henry told him he would be at the Bancroft place for supper. Rodrigo said nothing about this directly, but the quantities of biscuits he turned out on those mornings indicated a man who understood that his employer needed to bring something, and that showing up empty-handed was not acceptable behavior. Pete, who was 22 and in love with a girl in town named Alice, and therefore considered himself an authority on romantic developments, told Henry directly one morning that he was sweet on the widow, and that everyone could see it. Henry told Pete to go fix the northern water trough. The water trough did not need fixing, but Pete went to fix it anyway, whistling as he went, because he was 22 and optimistic, and he found the situation genuinely delightful. What was happening, if you were looking at it from the inside rather than the outside, was something considerably more complex and slow-building than the word sweet quite captured. Elvira was not a woman who came easily to trust. She had been self-sufficient for so long, had built her competence so specifically to the purpose of not needing to depend on anyone, that the experience of depending on someone, of beginning to want to, was both deeply appealing and faintly alarming. She liked Henry. She liked him with a specificity and a depth that was increasing in ways she examined honestly and without pretense, as she examined most things. She liked that he did not explain things to her that she already understood. She liked that, when she was wrong about something she did not know, which happened, he told her simply and without condescension. She liked the way he moved through his work, purposeful and unhurried, the same economy of motion she had watched in people who were genuinely good at what they did. She liked that he was kind to his horses and fair to Rodrigo and patient with Pete's endless optimism. She liked the gray of his eyes, and the way his hands looked when he was working, and the way his voice changed register slightly when he was saying something he meant especially seriously. She also liked, though she spent some time examining this particular fact for its implications, that he was not afraid of her. Many men were afraid of her. She had watched it happen in social situations all her life, the particular retreat of men who encountered a woman who was smarter than they were and who was not interested in hiding it. Henry was not afraid of her. He was not competitive with her. He was not intimidated or resentful or silently calculating how to reduce her. He was simply there, fully and directly, and he looked at her as though what he saw was something worth looking at. One evening in late September, they were sitting on the porch in the cool air that came down from the mountains when the sun went, and the sky was doing the extraordinary things that the Wyoming sky did in September with the light going out of it, layers of color so specific and so brief that you had to pay attention or miss them entirely. Henry was quiet for a long time. "My mother left when I was 8, he said, without preamble. It was the kind of thing you said when you had been building toward it without knowing it. She didn't leave the family specifically. She left the frontier. She couldn't bear it anymore. The winters and the isolation and the work that never ended. She went back to Ohio where she was from, and my father raised me and my sister, and I think he understood her reasons even though it broke something in him that didn't fully heal." Elvira listened the way she always listened, with her whole attention. "Did you understand her reasons?" she asked. He thought about it. "I do now," he said. "This place takes everything you have and keeps asking. Some people can give that. Some people can't. Neither one is wrong exactly. They're just different." He looked out at the mountains. "I always thought if I ever got married it would have to be someone who could give it, who chose this life, not just ended up in it." The air between them changed by 1 degree. She was looking at the mountains too. "I chose it," she said quietly. "Not because of Thomas, because of this." She made a small gesture that took in the sky, the valley, the dark outline of the Mersey below them. I chose it the first time Thomas brought me here before we married, and I've been certain about that choice ever since." "I know," he said. And then, because Henry Ellsworth was not a man who spoke indirectly when he meant something, he said, "Elvira, I have to tell you something." She turned to look at him. "I am falling in love with you," he said. "I have been for a while, and I know it's not long since you were in a very different kind of arrangement, and I'm not asking you for anything, not yet. I just need you to know, because I don't know how to be in the same space with someone as often as I'm in the same space with you without saying true things." She looked at him for a long moment, and the last of the light was fading, and the stars were beginning to come up behind the mountains. "I know you are," she said. It was not arrogance. It was the same direct, factual honesty she brought to everything. "I've known for some time." She paused, and he could see her choosing her next words with more care than usual, which was notable. "I want you to know that I am not unaffected," she said. "I am also not certain I know how to do this. I was content before, but I was not happy in the way I understand happiness could be, and I am not sure I have all the practical knowledge for the difference." He almost smiled. "You have practical knowledge for everything else." "This is different," she said, and there was something almost rueful in it. "It is," he agreed. "It is entirely different from everything else." She looked at him steadily. "I need more time," she said, "not because of uncertainty about you. Because I want to be certain I am coming to this clearly, for the right reasons, and not because the valley is lonely or because you have been kind. I have too much respect for both of us to do it any other way." "Then we have more time," he said, as though it were simple, and it was. October in the valley was cold and startling and beautiful in a way that was entirely different from September's beauty. And they spent it in the same patterns that had developed over the summer: coffee and conversation and working, alongside each other on the practical problems of two adjacent ranches going into winter. Henry showed her how to read the weather signs that the Wyoming sky gave in autumn, the particular formation of clouds that meant 3 days of clear, and the specific stillness of the air before a serious snow. She showed him a method for treating a respiratory ailment in cattle that she had read about in an agricultural journal, and that was more effective than the standard treatments most ranchers used. And he tried it on 3 sick animals, and was sufficiently impressed to ask for the journal details so he could read the article himself. She spent evenings reading. She had sent for books from the lending library in Denver, a service she had arranged through a correspondence friend who was a teacher there, and the books arrived monthly by the mail rider, and she worked through them with evident pleasure, and the same methodical attention she brought to documents and surveys. He borrowed 2 of them over the course of the autumn, returning them with brief notes inside the front cover commenting on specific passages, and she wrote back in the margins, and their conversation existed in 3 dimensions simultaneously, which she found more satisfying than anything she had experienced in years. Samuel Greer, who had been watching all of this with the patient attention of someone who had known Thomas Bancroft well, and who had formed his own opinions about what Thomas had been trying to give his wife, told Rodrigo over a fence line meeting one afternoon that he thought things were going in the right direction. Rodrigo, who had a deep and abiding confidence in the essential human capacity for eventually being sensible, agreed. The thing that changed was not a dramatic thing. It was an ordinary morning in mid-November, the first real snow of the season, and Elvira had ridden over to the Double E on arithmetic, because one of Henry's mares was due to foal and was showing signs that concerned Samuel's equivalent at the Double E, a man named Ollie who was excellent with cattle and adequate with horses, and who had the good sense to know the limit of his competence. Henry was already in the barn when she arrived. The mare was in the large foaling stall in the back corner, and the situation was, as Ollie had communicated, a presentation problem that, in 1882, without veterinary assistance closer than 50 miles, needed to be managed by whoever was there and whoever knew what they were doing. Elvira knew what she was doing. She handed arithmetic's reins to Pete, who had appeared from somewhere as Pete always appeared, and walked into the barn and assessed the situation in the first 45 seconds with a concentration that left no room for anything else. "She's positioned wrong," she said to Henry, who was crouching at the stall door. "The foal is not going to come the way it needs to unless someone corrects it." "Can you do that?" he asked. She was already rolling up her sleeve. "Move to the other side of her, keep her still, talk to her." He did exactly as she said, moving to the mare's opposite flank and placing his hands on her neck, and speaking in the low, steady murmur that horses responded to. And Elvira worked with the focused, unhurried calm of someone who had done difficult things in difficult circumstances, enough times to know that urgency expressed as panic was counterproductive. 40 minutes later, the foal was on the straw, wet and indignant and vigorous, and the mare was standing and already beginning to tend to it, and Elvira was cleaning her hands and forearms with a cloth and snow water from a bucket. Henry stood up from his position at the mare's head and looked at her across the stall, and what was in his face was something that had gone past admiration into something that did not have a clean word but that was entirely specific and entirely certain. She looked up and saw his expression. Something gave way in her chest, quietly, without drama. Not a collapse, but a release, the careful, deliberate setting down of a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it was heavy. The weight of the solitary competence, the forever of doing everything herself, the particular loneliness of being capable and unpartnered, which was a different and specific kind of loneliness from the ordinary kind. "Henry," she said. "Yes," he said, which was not an answer to her saying his name, but which was the right word for the moment they were both in. She crossed the stall in the clean, unhurried way she moved toward everything she had decided on, and when she reached him she put her hand against his chest, and he put his arms around her, and the mare and the new foal made their soft, content sounds in the straw behind them, and the snow fell in the silence outside the barn, and the moment was exactly what it was. He kissed her for the first time in the barn doorway with the snow still coming down, and it was not a tentative or uncertain kiss. It was the kind of kiss that two people who have been entirely patient with each other and entirely honest with each other for long enough produce when they finally stop waiting. A kiss that is the resolution of months of attention and respect, and the gradual, irresistible accumulation of someone who has become necessary. She kissed him back with the same directness she brought to everything, and when they parted she looked at him with clear, calm eyes and said, "I am in love with you too. I have been for some time." "I know," he said. And the way she laughed, brief and real and surprised at herself, was the finest sound he had heard in his 34 years. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a hard one, as Wyoming winters tended to be, but the Bancroft land and the Double E both came through it with minimal losses, partly because Elvira's autumn preparations had been thorough, and partly because they were working together in a practical partnership that the valley was beginning to understand was not temporary. Silas Pratt, faced with a winter that cost him more cattle than either of his neighbors, and without Walsh's financial backing, which had evaporated after the legal defeat in July, reached out through an intermediary in February to discuss a legitimate grazing agreement. Elvira reviewed his proposal, made 12 specific changes that made it fair rather than merely acceptable, and offered it back. He accepted. The agreement was signed in March in the same land office where she had laid the deed on the counter in June, and Gerald Potts notarized it with an expression that contained, Henry thought, a significant quantity of respect that had not been there before. Walsh left the valley entirely that winter. Henry heard he had moved operations to Montana, where presumably someone else's land and water was being examined for exploitable technicalities. He felt no particular regret about Walsh's departure, and he suspected Elvira did not either, though she said only that any vacuum in the valley's management would need to be watched. He asked her to marry him in March, when the snow was melting and the first green was coming up on the south-facing slopes and the Mercy was running high and cold and clean. He did not make a speech about it. He was not a man for speeches. He asked her in the kitchen of the Bancroft house over coffee and a practical discussion of the spring water management schedule, which was perhaps not the setting of romantic imagination, but which was, for both of them, exactly right. "I want to marry you," he said, between the question of the eastern tributary flow rate and the issue of the northern fence repair. "I want to do this properly, with a preacher and a witness and a ring, if you'll have me. I want to combine the properties and raise a family here, and I want to do it with you." She looked at him across the table. The coffee was strong and the morning light was good, and arithmetic was visible through the kitchen window, standing in the paddock in the weak March sunshine with her ears forward and her eyes half closed in contentment. "Yes," said Elvira Bancroft. That simply, that directly, with a small, certain smile that was the most complete thing he had seen in his life. They were married in May of 1883, on the porch of the Bancroft house, with Samuel Greer and Rodrigo and Pete's young woman Alice and Archibald Drum, who had made the trip from Denver because he said someone should represent Thomas's intentions adequately, and a Methodist minister who traveled the territory circuit, and who performed the ceremony with a practical efficiency that both Henry and Elvira privately appreciated. The ring was a gold band, simple and plain, which Henry had ridden to the jeweler in Laramie to buy in February after she had said yes, and which fit her finger exactly because he had noticed, over the months of working alongside her, exactly what her hands were like. There was a celebration in the evening that included most of the valley, because Redemption Valley had decided, by that point, that things were better run the way they were now being run, and that the people who were running them deserved to be celebrated. Henry danced with her on the porch in the May dark, one hand at her waist and one hand holding hers, and the music was a fiddle played by a man from the south end of the valley who was good at it, and the stars were out in the enormous, uncomplicated way that Wyoming stars came out, thick and bright and unreserved. "Are you happy?" he asked her quietly over the fiddle. She thought about it in the honest, deliberate way she thought about everything, and then she said, "I am happy in a way I did not know was available to me. Yes." He held her a little closer, and she did not resist it, and the fiddle played on. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that is, in retrospect, the foundation of everything that follows. They combined the operation of both properties into a single, efficiently run enterprise that was, by the end of 1883, the most successful in the valley, not because they were lucky, but because they were both exceptionally good at what they did, and because the particular combination of her analytical intelligence and legal knowledge, and his practical expertise and deep knowledge of the land and the cattle proved to be formidable. The books, which Elvira ran with the precision of a woman who could have been a bank accountant in a different life, showed a profit margin in the first year that surprised even them. She kept the Bancroft name on the property because it was historical and legally significant, and because she considered the continuity of that name on that land to be, in some sense, a final fulfillment of Thomas's intentions. The double E was absorbed into the Bancroft operations formally, though everyone still called Henry's original range the Ellsworth section, which was fine and accurate, and nobody needed to change. Rodrigo and Samuel Greer, who had been operating under a productive if unspoken détente since the spring, arrived at a genuine friendship over the course of a winter spent together managing the cold season livestock work. A friendship that involved very few words and considerable mutual respect, which was, both of them seemed to feel, the ideal basis for any relationship. Pete and Alice married in the fall of 1883 in the same Methodist minister's circuit visit that covered the north end of the territory, and Elvira gave them a small piece of land at the edge of the Bancroft property as a wedding gift, with a long-term lease arrangement that Pete could eventually convert to ownership through labor and payment, which was the kind of arrangement that was fair and practical, and that gave a young man with ambition the means to become something, which was what Henry had always believed Pete would eventually be. In the spring of 1884, Elvira told Henry she was expecting a child. She told him in the direct, matter-of-fact way she told him things, sitting at the breakfast table with her coffee and her notebook, and said, "I spoke to Dr. Marsh in town yesterday and he confirmed that I'm with child. The timing puts it at September." Henry set down his fork. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was entirely unguarded, no composure, no frontier stoicism, just the plain face of a man who had been given something he had wanted for longer than he had been willing to fully admit. "Elvira," he said, and his voice was not steady. "It will need to be managed carefully," she said, but her own voice was not entirely steady either, which was unusual and which she did not try to hide. "I intend to continue working through the summer as long as I'm able, and I'll need to establish an arrangement with Dr. Marsh for the later months." "Yes," he said, and then he pushed back his chair and came around the table, and she stood up, and he put his arms around her and held on in the way that was entirely different from how he had held her at other moments, with a depth of feeling that had no practical application. That was just the feeling itself. She put her arms around him in return, and they stood in the kitchen with the morning coming through the windows, and did not say anything for a while. The baby came in September of 1884, a boy, delivered with Dr. Marsh present and Henry somewhere in the hallway, doing the kind of helpless pacing that even the most competent men tend toward on such occasions. The birth was not easy, because births in that era rarely were, but Elvira navigated it with the same focused capacity she brought to every hard thing, and at the end of it she was tired in a way she had not previously understood tiredness could feel, and she was holding a small, solid, apparently offended person who had arrived in the world with considerable noise. Henry came in when the doctor told him he could and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife, and the expression on his face was not something he tried to put words to, and she did not ask him to. "Marcus," she said, before he could suggest anything, "for your father." He could not speak for a moment. "Yes," he said when he could. "Marcus." Marcus Ellsworth grew up on the Bancroft land with the particular advantage of two highly competent parents who believed that knowledge was portable and that the world was worth understanding thoroughly. He learned to ride before he could reliably walk in a straight line, because his mother put him on a horse's back in front of her almost as soon as he could sit upright, and the horse was always quiet and steady because his mother chose the horse carefully. He learned to read from Elvira's books and to calculate from Elvira's financial ledgers, which she began teaching him to understand from the age of 4 with a patient, clear methodology that the Valley's school teacher, when Marcus eventually attended the small school established in Redemption in 1888, found had given him an educational foundation she had rarely seen in a child of his age. Silas Pratt, who had signed the grazing agreement and had largely kept the peace since then, died in 1886 of a winter fever, and his ranch was sold to a young family from Kansas who were exactly what the Valley needed and who became good neighbors and eventually good friends. The shadow that had hung over the first year of Elvira's time in the Valley dissolved with Pratt's departure from it, and the Valley settled into a working peace that felt, to those who had lived through the conflict, like something genuinely earned. A second child arrived in 1887, a girl that Elvira named Clara after her father's mother, a woman she had known only from stories and who had been, by those accounts, someone worth naming a child for. Clara had Henry's gray eyes and her mother's absolute certainty about her own opinions, which Henry found both deeply familiar and somehow freshly charming in the small person his daughter was. He told Elvira, one evening with the children in bed and the house quiet and the lamp burning between them at the kitchen table, that he thought Clara was going to be trouble in the best possible way. "She's going to be extraordinary," Elvira said, correcting him mildly. Those things overlap considerably, he said. She laughed. He still loved her laugh, its brevity and its realness and its slight surprise at itself. He thought he would love it his entire life and that this was something to be grateful for. Henry, she said, setting down her book and looking at him with the full, direct attention she had brought to everything since the first morning he had walked into her barn and watched her quiet a difficult horse. I want to tell you something. He set down his own reading. That day I rode into Redemption Valley, she said, with the deed. I was completely certain about the legal situation. I had prepared everything. I knew what I was doing. She paused. What I did not know was whether I could endure the part after it. The part of being here alone, of building something in a place where everyone already had their arrangements and their allegiances and where a widow was, at best, a problem to be managed. She looked at him steadily. I did not expect you. He looked back at her. I didn't expect you either, he said. I want you to know, she said, carefully and clearly in the way she said things she meant most specifically, that you are the best thing I have found in this valley, better than the land, better than the water rights, better than everything I came here to hold. He was quiet for a moment, because some things deserved a moment before you answered them. You came here for what was yours, he said finally, and you held it. And I am glad beyond what I can adequately express that I was in that land office on that particular morning, and that I was standing near the door, and that I got out of your way and then couldn't stop thinking about why. She reached across the table and took his hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the simple, everyday gesture of two people who had chosen each other fully, and who exercised that choice in 100 small and unremarkable moments every day. Which was, in the end, what love looked like when it was real. Outside the kitchen window, the valley was dark and the mountains were dark above it, and the Mersey ran on in the dark toward wherever it was going, as it had always run, and as it would go on running, steady and cold and entirely itself, through the land that bore the name of the woman who had ridden in that June morning with a deed in her leather satchel, and the certain, unfrightened knowledge of what was hers. In 1889, Wyoming became a state, and Elvira sat at her kitchen table and read the news in the paper that came by mail rider and felt, in the specific way she felt everything, the weight of it. Wyoming's constitution, she had read in the preparatory documents, would include women's suffrage, had in fact included it in its territorial government since 1869. It was not a small thing. It was the kind of thing her father would have read about and said, quietly, that knowledge was portable and so was progress, given enough time and enough people willing to work for it. She told Henry over supper. He listened with the attention he gave to everything she considered important. It's right, he said. It should have been that way everywhere from the start. She looked at him across the table, and Marcus, who was 5, was eating with the focused commitment of a child, who had decided that supper was currently the most important thing in his experience, and Clara was not yet 2, and was making commentary on her porridge in sounds that had not yet resolved into language but that were clearly communicating something specific. This was her life. This ordinary, extraordinary, entirely chosen life. In later years, the people of Redemption Valley told the story of the widow who had ridden in with the deed as a legend, the way communities do when something has happened that captures something essential about a place and a time. They told it in the way that legends get told, with additions and embellishments a little larger each year, the confrontation in the land office growing more dramatic, the legal victory more sweeping. But those who had been there, Samuel Greer and Rodrigo and Pete, and the few others who had witnessed the actual morning when Elvira Bancroft laid the deed on Gerald Potts' counter and told him to read it, those people told it straight. They said she was something entirely herself. They said she had come in out of the dust and the miles, and had stood in that room with her back straight and her leather satchel across her shoulder, and had laid down a piece of paper that settled every question anyone had thought to ask, and that she had done it without a raised voice or a wasted word. And they said, the ones who had known her long enough to know the whole story, that the best thing about Elvira Bancroft was not the deed, impressive as it was. The best thing was that she had built a life in that valley that was real and whole and deeply her own, with her books and her horses and her notebooks, and her surveying knowledge and her kitchen that smelled of good coffee. And with Henry, who had known from a morning in November in a foaling stall that this was the person worth being completely and honestly himself with. Henry Ellsworth in 1892, when Marcus was 8 and Clara was 5 and a third child, a boy they named William, was one and discovering the world with a ferocity that required constant parental attention, was asked by a traveling journalist who was writing about the women of the frontier whether he found it unusual to have a wife who was, as the journalist put it, quite so capable and self-determined. Henry considered the question with the patience he brought to questions that deserved a real answer. "No," he said, "I find it essential. I fell in love with her because of it, not in spite of it. A woman who knows her own mind is not a challenge to manage. She's a person worth knowing." The journalist wrote it down. It ran in a Denver paper, and someone sent Elvira a copy. She read it at the kitchen table over her morning coffee, and when she finished it, she folded it and put it in the ledger box where she kept things worth keeping. Henry came in from the barn and poured himself coffee and sat down across from her, and she looked at him over the top of her cup with the expression he had catalogued over years now, direct and clear and holding, somewhere behind it, the warmth that was his and had always been specifically his. "You were diplomatic," she said. "I was accurate," he said. "That too," she agreed. The morning light came in through the kitchen windows of the house on the Bancroft land. In the valley the Mercy ran through, in the Wyoming that was now a state and that was still becoming itself, as all places and all people were always still becoming themselves, and two people drank their coffee and planned their day and were, in all the specific and daily and real ways that mattered, entirely and completely happy. Marcus came down for breakfast, loud and already asking questions. Clara followed, with her gray eyes and her certainties. William, in the back room, announced his continued existence at considerable volume until Elvira went to him and picked him up, and he subsided immediately, which was how it always went with William, who simply needed to know someone was there. Henry watched her from the kitchen doorway with the child on her hip and the morning light around both of them, and felt what he had been feeling for 9 years now, the particular and specific and absolutely certain feeling that had started in a land office doorway when a woman walked past him into the sunlight with a leather satchel, and the complete, untroubled knowledge of what was hers, and that had only deepened and specified and confirmed itself every day since. There were no dark pasts unresolved. There were no hidden motives remaining in play. There were no traps that had not been dismantled, no betrayals that had not been accounted for, no forced choices that had not been made clearly and freely and well. The valley was peaceful. The land was theirs. The books balanced. The horses were sound. The children were vivid and healthy and loud and here. Elvira Bancroft came back to the kitchen with William and settled him in his chair and looked at Henry in the doorway and said, "Are you going to stand there or are you going to have breakfast?" He came to the table. He sat across from her, and the children were between them and around them, and the coffee was strong, and the biscuits that Rodrigo had taught Henry to make in the early years of their marriage, because Rodrigo had considered it a basic competency, were warm and good. And Elvira Bancroft Ellsworth, who had ridden into the valley with a deed nobody expected her to hold, who had held it and everything it meant, and who had found in the holding a life that was bigger and better and more genuinely hers than even the deed had been, poured herself a second cup of coffee and picked up her pencil and began the morning's work. The Mercy ran on. The mountains stood. The valley held everything it had always held and more besides. This was enough. This was, in every precise and honest sense of the word, everything.